This is a project done by 2 electrical engineers and us, the legal people. So I'd like to introduce you to Tony Song, who's the person who worked on the legal aspect and is very precious. And it is a bit different from the things that, and I think actually one of the engineers was here. He may come back. That's Matthew Priestley. Yeah. So it was very much working on a project to ensure that drones were more reliable, and then looking to whether that would actually turn into something that would make it legal liability less. So this is very much it's previous. Most of these have had big issues about surveillance, privacy, and so on, and some of those do still exist, but. We're picked on the freight industry because the issues of liability are there, more sort of general liability, personal injury, those kinds of things, because, as you may have noticed, it is extremely unnatural for things to stay up in the sky. If things stay up in the sky, that's fine, but when they fall, and most drones sit at about, could we click on please? Most drones are supposed to be under 400 metres from the ground, but that you get to terminal velocity at about 30 metres. So it's a significant issue if a drone or a bit of it or the freight it's carrying falls to the ground, particularly if it falls on you. And it might, of course, cause personal injury or property damage. I guess one of the things is, David and Genevieve and Alana were talking about the issues of new technology and new law. And I guess my take on that is really that there's constant change. There has always been change. And, they probably had to change the law to deal with the pencil when it was the first technology. So this is just the standard process of applying the law we know to a slightly different thing. So I'm just going to talk about this is here because, when I mostly speak to people about this, they go, oh, no one's doing that, are they? And I said, no, yes, they are. So this is Coles' latest. 2nd of March, they announced that they were beginning drone delivery in Canberra. And they're going to be carrying stuff like that. There's also, and the next one, there's also a whole range of things. But first, let's just get some terminology. Drones are mostly called remotely piloted aircraft by people who are in the know. I'll probably use drones because I find it easier. But there's a series of names that are used. The one that's used in the Australian legislation is mostly an RPA, that is a remotely piloted aircraft. And I guess one of the things to say about drones is that airspace between 400 metres and below, that hasn't really been a used airspace before drones because aircraft are supposed to be higher. And so it's taking advantage of that airspace. It can allow the cutting down of infrastructure. You don't need so many, you don't need roads and things like that. And it's growing at a phenomenal rate. So that we're talking about the package delivery market in the US in 2020 being 532 million. You might say, well, they've got 300 million people, so that's only 2 each or something, but it's just really growing fast. Next one. So what makes it new technology? Well, it is because of the way they're flown. It's because there's a lot of software involved. There's continuous data coming into the aircraft to determine location and behaviour. They are autonomous or semi-autonomous. They may well have a controller that's back on the ground somewhere who is keeping a general eye on things. They can also be targets for hacking, which is quite a big issue, because they are using Wi-Fi and so on in order to manage their issues. And the remote piloting creates some issues that are quite like those that I presume Tanya will be talking about later in relation to autonomous cars. So they use sense and avoid technology so they don't have collisions with everything and so on. Next. So one of the biggest ones that I wasn't really aware of until we looked into this was that a large part of the drone industry is that last mile, the first mile and the last mile of delivery. So, you know, you put your stuff on the train, goes to the train, from there the drone takes it the next mile to where it's going to be delivered to. So that is actually a quite significant amount of the drone freight industry. And it's mostly carried on in urban areas, and there's quite a lot of this going on in Canberra, Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane. Sydney doesn't seem to be doing quite as much of it yet. Then there's the automation of the intralogistics, so they end up automating factories and warehouses and so on to interface with them. There is supply of medical goods, so your drone brings in, you know, a vial of something, which actually it's naughty to do this, but it reminds me of when I was a child. My father was a doctor in the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea, and he had a person who had snakebite and they didn't have any antivenin. So he radioed the nearest place and said, could you send some out in a Cessna? And the Cessna came out, flew around the hospital once, and the pilot dropped a handkerchief parachute with the one vial of antivenin in it. Dad walked out from the hospital, caught it and went back and injected it into the car. So that's the kind of thing we need. The delivery of antivenins, all those sorts of things. And for there, that's often where there's low accessibility, where it's hard to get things like that. And then the air freight issues, that will go all over the place. But the first and last mile stuff is definitely an urban phenomenon. So the dangers we are mostly going to talk about are the personal injury and death, property damage, and the other thing is nuisance. Nuisance created by noise or pollution, which is one of the things that may come up in relation to freight drones. Okay. So I don't want to say that there's no surveillance and privacy issues with drones. There clearly is, but most drones that are actually doing surveillance have really good cameras and a different configuration from most freight zones, which will still have cameras, but they're often nothing like as acute or as accurate. And anyway, I think that it's important for us to look at the things that people generally don't think about. So next slide, please. So these are just some examples of drone services. I guess one of the things that I thought was interesting was that one of the first drone freight things was delivering pizzas. So delivering pizzas, delivering coffee, stuff like that. And it's now growing, and the parcels are getting bigger. And of course, we now have even things like that one drone, like drone taxis, which are starting to develop. Next one, please. Now, in Melbourne and Logan Valley in Brisbane, Wing, which is a drone delivery service, is delivering food and various other things in very urban areas. And this is an advertisement that Wing has put out, which I thought was interesting. It talks about how it's built with purposeful redundancies, and including multiple hover motors and multiple navigation systems, and that they've flight tested the system many times. And the redundancies is the main way that people try to protect against liability at present. And this paper is about the possibility of using bearing monitors to do that instead. But anyway, the pandemic did a lot of good for Wing drones, who increased their business by 500% during the pandemic. So this is a quickly moving area. And so far, we've certainly had drones fall, we have had problems. We haven't had very many examples of drones actually falling on someone and killing them or anything like that. So we're still not getting, there's no kind of groundswell of public worry at this stage, I don't think. Okay, so it's an unmanned system, and the system allows it to navigate around other aircraft and so on. So if we go to the next one. So this is how Wing does its stuff in Canberra and Brisbane. So it's, you know, they're navigating around other objects, and the legal issues that come up in relation to this kind of damage, the sort of things we're doing are, you know, personal injury, death, property damage, nuisance, and what we're interested in mostly here is damage on the ground. So we have, and this is going on over areas of where there are populations of, you know, like 200,000 in the Logan Valley. So and in Canberra, quite densely settled, where people are having drones sort of zipping around them. Yeah, and the Wing drones are an example of what I was saying. They only have still image and grayscale, low resolution cameras. So it isn't such a privacy or surveillance issue because the technology isn't for them. So if we go to the next one. So obviously drones have come in as a sort of a different version of aircraft, and the aircrafts we mostly think about and generally are the ground risks and the air risks. So the ground risks are landing with, you know, colliding with the person or property on the ground. And to deal with that, there are structural system monitoring. There are various monitoring systems, some automatic descent functions, and redundancies, parachutes, things like that. The air risks, well, obviously collision with wildlife, collision with other things in the air, aircraft and so on, and of course for drones in the area that they're in, the possibility of crashing into overhead wires and those sorts of things. And for them, most of the ways of avoiding it is aerial avoidance technologies, that is sense and avoid technology and so on. Now, one of the issues here is that all of this stuff is just continuously being developed because it's relatively new, so there's constant change. And so, which has made the regulation rather tricky. And okay, so I'll just talk quite briefly about governmental regulation, and then we'll talk about the bit that I'm more interested in. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the civil aviation laws apply to drones as they do to other aircraft. Drones seem to be divided into these categories, and for our purposes, basically anything above 250 grams might be a drone that is relevant. The micro RPAs are regarded as toys. They're not actually in the legislation. The term RPA does not include them. So the ones you're seeing whizzing around the field that some kids doing like a remote, they probably aren't part of this, so they don't have to be registered. They don't have to have a person being certified to pilot them, you know, all that sort of stuff. But the others do. And the other thing to note here, I guess, is that this seems to be everywhere. There's very little international regulation of these. So every country is doing its own thing. So what you'll find, for example, is in the US, what they call a very small RPA is different from what it is in Australia. So it can be quite confusing going between bits of legislation. The next one. So that's basically getting accredited or registered if you're operated for a purpose other than sport and recreation, and it's not an aircraft used for education, training or research weighing less than 7 kilos. So the definitions vary for different purposes and so on, but for our purpose, because this is commercial, the freight industry is commercial, 250 grams and up is what's covered. And if you're doing it for a business, then you're generally going to need a remote pilot licence or a remote operator licence certificate in order to manage these things. So, you know, that stuff is all about being a safe aircraft under the legislation. Liability under the governmental rules is covered by the Damage by Aircraft Act. Can we go to the next slide, please? Of 1999, which has state counterparts. Now, as with everything in Australian law, where there are states and federal, everybody's different. And one of the things that's different is that some of these Damage by Aircraft Acts need impact before there can be liability, and some of them don't. But the basic rule for most of these is that if there's damage caused by an aircraft in flight, which includes landing and taking off, then there's a strict liability response. And that case that's referred to there, South Baton and Commonwealth, that was, of course, not about an RPA. It was about an ordinary aircraft where someone was hit on the ground. And the basic way it's read is to say, well, the civilian had absolutely no control. The civilian didn't volunteer for this. The civilian was just on the ground having no idea something was heading for them. And therefore, that the aircraft operator, or is the person who should be held entirely responsible. Now, trespass and nuisance, very hard to bring under this legislation unless it complies with the air navigation regulation. So I think that, and I guess the other thing to say is that this legislation, for example, I said it was all different. The Commonwealth legislation covers psychiatric harm. Most of the state legislations don't, for example. So there are differences in what you can get compensation for, and so on. The legislation also excludes economic loss. So if you want to bring an action in economic loss, you either have to use the consumer law or negligence. And then moving away from that, the liability under that act, which is fairly limited, then we would be thinking about negligence, particularly including product liability, and the trespasser torts and nuisance as issues that may well arise in relation to this. Now, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so now we're starting to get into the issue of what is the real interface as far as we're concerned between the technology and the liability. And for this paper, we're looking particularly at how drone bearings operate and how important they are for the workings of the thing. So for a person who is sort of basically kind of a Luddite, basically, as I understand it, which is no doubt simpler than the rest of you, okay, the thing's staying up because it's got propellers. What's making the propellers go? The motor's making the propellers go around. What's making the motor keep going? The bearing, which is what it moves around. And so it means that if the bearing goes, then the whole thing's going to, well, you're going to have so this is not necessarily going to be a loss of a parcel, it's going to be the whole thing falling out of the sky, usually, if there is a problem with the bearing motors. And if we go to the next one, like everything else, objects become fatigued over time. And so what Matthew and Elias have been doing is working on the development of a monitor for bearings in drones, and trying to work on that as a way of reducing the likelihood of liability. So at the moment, the most common cause of drone bearing failure is that they haven't done enough maintenance, or there hasn't been enough redundancy in the system. And so what they do is they set up a really strict maintenance schedule and take out the bearing, replace it at certain intervals, which is really important. Problem is, you might be taking out a bearing that's still perfectly okay. You might be keeping one that isn't, but mostly that won't be happening. And if your drone is quite heavy, it becomes harder to have more redundant components and things. So what they have been doing is developing a way to monitor the bearing condition so that you can actually prepare for the maintenance and the failure before it occurs. And because it will allow, for example, commercial fleets, the freight drones, to have relative confidence about the extent to which their fleet is safe, which is, of course, important and one of the things that we're most interested in. Okay, so on to the next slide. So why do they fail? Well, there's fatigue, which is what I already talked about, but there's also contamination, corrosion, incorrect manufacturing, incorrect storing, incorrect installation, excessive load, excessive vibration. So there are actually lots of ways that this one thing can become problematic. And so the idea is that if we can monitor, then we can warn of that program. So working on a strict maintenance schedule won't work if you've suddenly got a corrosion problem that you really didn't factor into your maintenance schedule and so on. So, and equipment problems seem to be responsible for a significant proportion of accidents, which is, I mean, what else could it be? Isn't that all they are, equipment? So anyway, I would have thought that if they fell out of the sky, I suppose it would be pilots.
Weather.
And weather, yeah. Oh, and the other thing is, I don't know if it's equipment, the other thing that has caused a problem, of course, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is hacking. So jamming and what's it called? Spoofing. Okay, next one. Okay, so as I said before, using a system a monitoring system can avoid some of these problems that we already have had, including the issue that maintenance is mainly internal and based on their own discretion or expertise. That's actually a really big one because it means that it's very difficult, especially because at the moment there doesn't appear to be inspection of these companies or anything, that it's based on their own incentives and so on. There will be the issue that there may be false positives, but it will reduce the possibility of things falling out of the sky, which is what we are concerned with. Okay, so the next, please. All right, so if we think about it in relation to negligence, I think one of the things that really disappoints the engineers is that I say you can never guarantee there's no liability. You just can't. So you're saying, yeah, it'll be liability. Yeah, that sounds really good. Oh no, we can't ever guarantee that there will be no liability. But we certainly can reduce the possibility. And so if we consider this, now this is a fairly straightforward thing for lawyers. This is, we have the tort of negligence. The possible defendants in this scenario include all those: the operator, the owner, the manufacturer, the distributor, the person responsible for maintenance, and so on. And indeed, in some situations, it will be all of them. And if it's all of them, then that will just be a matter of working out who's causally related and working out the proportion of damages that they will pay. The other thing is pretty clear that the manufacturer is going to owe a duty to innocent bystanders on the ground. It's not difficult. So the duty issues are not actually very hard. It's basically, is it foreseeable? And the question is how long the chain of foreseeability has to go. So, so that would go to things like, there was a case where a plane hit plane hit the ground, was just near an electrical, what do we call it? One of those substations. Substation caught on fire. They sent it hit it, an electrician was sent to look at it. There was a fire. He didn't do the right thing and he was injured. There was a question about whether that was too remote or not. Ultimately, they decided it wasn't, but yeah. Okay, I've got to get cracking then. Okay, so one of the points though, in terms of who owes the duty, is how we decide it. Whether we say, is it all about whether there is anybody involved being a defendant, or are we going to do something which I think we might be doing with autonomous cars, which is to be saying who's in control rather than who's the operator or who's the driver or who's the whatever, who's actually in control might be a better way of approaching the issues. Okay, so coming to breach of duty, next slide please. In relation to breach, obviously micro drones are much less likely to cause harm to people who are on the ground than a bigger one is, but as I said before, you reach terminal velocity quite quickly, and even a small thing can do a lot of damage from 400 metres above the ground. So, you know, it still needs to be careful. And of course, we know that people don't look up. People wander around looking at the ground. They don't look up, except for me, because I had a very tall husband, so I always look for everything up here. So the weighing up thing is, how is the monitor going to affect this? The monitor is going to make it much more likely that the operator or whoever is, and the manufacturer, whoever is actually doing the right things. That is, that they are acting like a reasonable person in those circumstances. And so, as I say, that's the test. As we know, to outsiders, it often doesn't mean very much because it becomes something that you become familiar with when you read millions of negligence cases. But you need to do whatever that reasonable person would do in those circumstances, and having made sure that there's a bearing monitor may well be as much as can be expected in lots of situations. Next. Okay, so you just have to show causation. There's issues though created by things like jamming or spoofing. Now, I know what jamming is, but I know spoofing is making a GPS receiver calculate a false position. So those things, there's a possibility that you'll say, well, that's a break in the chain of causation. And that's just normal negligence principles. There's nothing really different about that. But the other thing that a drone bearing condition monitor can do is it keeps information. So it keeps information to trace liability and so on. So you've got data there that can be used in that way. Yes. So the next thing, and I'm not going to spend very much time at all on this, is the Australian consumer law. So, you know, lots of people here know all about the Australian consumer law. I guess the things in relation to drones that are interesting, I think, is that they may not be aware of how broadly the term manufacturers defined under the ACL. And so the distributor is going to be covered as well as the manufacturer and so on. And the safety defect is not, did it cause harm, but is it something that's likely to be a defect? And of course, the other thing is, of course, there could be defective manufacture, it could be defective design, and also defective marketing. So there's quite a range within the Australian consumer law, and it may well also be able to deal with. Is that the end of my time?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. All right. In that case, I want to talk about nuisance. So there are media reports. You need to go on to number 23. Media reports of wings operations have been dogs going mad, children being scared to play in the backyard because of the racket from the drones, birds disappearing from the area. because wing is flying in all daylight hours 7 days a week in Canberra. So there's been a bit of talk about that. The drone bearing is relevant here because it can actually reduce the vibration that the drone is using, which actually increases the noise considerably. So keeping that noise down can be done. But how this works, nuisance is about give and take. It's about you can't complain that person moved to the area where the nuisance was happening. There's a lot of things that need to be weighed up in that situation. But it does seem as if keeping noise down is going to be really important in the area where they're going to do most of their deliveries, which is close urban neighbourhoods. And my last thing is just that the air navigation, aircraft noise regulation will apply. That's quite apart from common law nuisance. The Protection of Environmental Operations Act of 1997 in New South Wales also will apply, and that controls levels of noise. So that's quite significant. And I guess what we've got here is a number of novel legal scenarios. So some people have said, well, we'll have aerial freight, so there'll be a lot less car accidents. Well, yes, let's hope so. But let's not replace them with drone accidents. And of course, when an RPA goes wrong, what's likely to happen is something will fall to the ground. That's the most likely thing, and it can be very, very dangerous. So I think it's a really good idea to go for. A maintenance schedule is clearly going to be important. Redundancy, all those things are still going to be important. But if you add this, the bearing monitoring device in, then it's very arguable that that's one of, against that kind of failure, that's one of the most significant things to use that could reduce liability overall. So that's it.